So I'd like to present for you now in two parts, two lectures on one of my favorite philosophers from ancient Greece, namely Epicurus. Epicurus was born the son of Nicoles, who was an Athenian school teacher, and he was born on the island of Samos, that island we talked about. He was born in 341 BC. And during the time of his youth, the Greek world was in convulsions from the turmoil that resulted from the death and destruction of the empire that Alexander the Great had tried to establish. So when Alexander died in 323 BC, the Greek world was in turmoil. And this was the time of Epicurus's young life. Well, he and his family, his father Nicoles and his mother, they had been visiting in Athens at the time of the occupation of Samos, and so they couldn't return to Samos. And so they lost all their property, and they had to travel throughout the Greek world, through Ionia. And so Epicurus's young life was full of tumult, and it was a nomadic kind of life. During his travels with his family, and then later on as a young man, Epicurus acquired an education from a certain Nausiphanes, who was a teacher of the philosopher Democritus, who was a great atomist, pre-Socratic philosopher. Democritus discovered the atom. And so Epicurus had entered into this atomic theory in his physics, and that will become part of his teaching. But also during this time, he'd fully appropriated the teachings of all the pre-Socratic schools of thought and those great giants that came before him, namely Plato and Aristotle. Sometime in his 20s, Epicurus began to teach his own distinctive philosophy at Mytilene around 311 BC, afterwards at Lampsacus. At that time, as a young man, Epicurus drew at first a small group of disciples around him, and then later a large community. And so he decided to establish his own school, much like the school of the great philosopher that came before him, Aristotle, the Lyceum, and before that, the Academy of Plato. Only Epicurus developed a community of learning outside the polis, in the country, and he called it the garden. So this is the garden of Epicurus. There he'll continue his teaching activities until his death. And unlike the Lyceum of Aristotle and the Academy of Plato, the garden emphasized even more so than Plato and Aristotle, who emphasized friendship. But this was a community of learning that included women, and it included slaves, as well as citizens of the various city-states. So the Garden of Epicurus was the center of his activities until his death. So within the garden, there was much discussion and practice of the Epicurean way of life. And as I move through here, I would like you to think about what parts of Aristotle's ethics did Epicurus appropriate? What part of Plato did he appropriate? And then what parts did he tweak and change? And how did he move in his own direction? In other words, compare and contrast Epicurus with the great Plato and Aristotle that came before him, and the pre-Socratics too. So I already mentioned two things that should jump out at you after having looked at the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle, namely Democritus, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher. I said that Epicurus appropriated his atomic theory, and also this idea of friendship, which was so important to both Plato and Aristotle. But I'd like to dwell a little more on friendship before we enter into the actual works of Epicurus. In his will, for example, which has been preserved, it details provisions for those in his circle and for the upbringing of the education of the children of the people in his circle. There's a letter that still exists from Epicurus to a young child, and it reads as follows. We have arrived at Lampsacus safe and sound, Epicurus writes. Pythocles and Hermarchus and Steppius and I, and there we found also Themista and our other friends as well. I hope you two are well and your mama, and that you are always obedient to your papa and matro, and you as you used to be. Let me tell you, the reason that I and all the rest love you so much is that you've always been so obedient to them. What I think is important about this letter is that it illustrates the concern that Epicurus showed for his followers, even for the children of his followers. It demonstrates the great importance of friendship, philia, for Epicurus within the Epicurean community. In fact, I want to dwell on that because it's one of the ingredients of the good life for Epicurus. It was that way for Aristotle too. As I told you, remember in the Nicomachean Ethics, books 8 and 9 are all devoted to friendship. And I told you how rich and deep of a concept of friendship there was in Plato. Whole dialogues developed on that. For Epicurus, friendship was a necessary part of living well. In other words, it was a necessary condition for living what he called the blessed life, a eudaimonic life. So that word eudaimonia should jump out at you, which he learned from Aristotle. Friendship, therefore, is an integral part of the ethics of Epicurus and was taught by Epicurus, both explicitly and by example. That Epicurus taught the importance of friendship by example, that is, by being himself a good friend to each of his followers, can be seen by reading the life of Epicurus by Diogenes Laertius. I'd like you to remember his name. I'm not going to test you on that or anything, but you should know about Diogenes Laertius is one of the important persons we have who wrote the lives of the philosophers, who was an ancient intellectual historian in his own right. He didn't develop his own philosophy, but he chronicled the philosophies of the ancients, and many of these works that he espouses are lost now. So all we have to go on is Diogenes. And that reminds me, this is an important point. It's a bibliographical point, but Epicurus is the most prolific philosopher that we know of, for sure in ancient times. He wrote over 400 papyrus scrolls, which are books today. But all we have are 3 letters by Epicurus. The letter to Menoetius, that's the ethical doctrine. That's the most important one, I think. There's another one to Herodotus, the father of history. You know, before Herodotus, there was no history. I mean, there were chronicles of, different kings winning certain battles and so on, but they were not fair-minded, objective accounts of the past. So Herodotus is the father of history, and he wrote of the Persian Wars, where King Darius invades Greece twice, and the Greeks beat them off twice, outsmarted them, and won the battles, won the war. So Epicurus wrote this letter to Herodotus. There's also a letter to Pythocles, one of his disciples, and we have a letter to Menoetius. We have what we call the principal doctrines, which are epigrams. Epicurus was a master of the epigram. An epigram is something short that you can memorize. Like the greatest fruit of self-sufficiency is freedom. So one could memorize that, and then it becomes like a little nugget that you can return to, and they're profound little golden insights. So we have those epigrams, which are good because you don't really need the context. They're context free. And we have some charred remains of these 400 books that he wrote. In 78 AD, there was a Mount Vesuvius blew its stack and covered Pompeii. You probably know about that. But it also buried Herculaneum, which was, in Herculaneum, there was a great library there, and it buried and destroyed all the books in the library. So all we have are these charred remains from that library. Those are called the Vatican sayings, and they're contained in the Vatican Library today. So let me read to you just some excerpts from the principal doctrines and from the Vatican sayings that focus on friendship. Okay, there's Principal Doctrine 27. He writes, of the things that wisdom prepares for ensuring lifelong happiness, that's a locution you might want to hold on to. Lifelong happiness. That's going to be the key of Epicurus' teaching. Living, I mean, what he learned from Plato and Aristotle is that the main thing about learning is learning how to live. That philosophy is the art of living. In fact, he parts company with Aristotle. For Aristotle, although he emphasizes how to live in the ethics, but philosophy in general for Aristotle is the art of discovering truth. For Epicurus, the main thing is the art of living. So the accent is on living. Of the things that wisdom prepares for ensuring lifelong happiness, by far the greatest is the possession of friendship. That's the Principal Doctrine 27. 28. The same wisdom that permits us to be confident that no evil is eternal or even of long duration also recognizes that in our limited state, the security that can be most perfectly gained is that of friendship. Again, Vatican sayings 23. Every friendship is itself to be desired, but the first cause of friendship is a man's needs. This he learned from Aristotle, because when I studied Aristotle's notion of friendship, Aristotle taught that friendship starts with utilitarian needs, like one hand washes the other. But that's not true friendship for Aristotle, because for Aristotle, it has to do with mutual respect of each other's character. And that's going to be true for Epicurus too. They're just talking about how friendship starts usually. One person helps another. Another, those who are hasty in making friends are not to be approved, nor yet should you commend those who avoid friendship, for risks must be run for its sake. Some people avoid friendship because it makes them be vulnerable. And again, Vatican saying 34, we do not so much need the help of our friends as the confidence of their help in need, like moral support. Oh, there's so many. I wrote these lectures a long time ago, actually, and it was a day where I was up in Ashtabula, where I was born, and a big snowstorm came. I mean, big snow, where you couldn't open the door. And I had only works of Epicurus. So in 1984, I wrote these lectures, and I decided to return to those now after so long and just read them to you. So if it sounds a little stilted, just forgive that, because I want to share with you all the details and not go hastily through Epicurus. So let's just dwell on all these fragments of friendship. Another one on friendship. Neither he who is always seeking material aid from his friends, nor he who never thinks of such aid as possible is a true friend. For the one engages in petty trade, don't make your, and the other deprives himself of the hope of the future. Another one, Vatican saying 54. Friendship dances through the world, bidding all to awaken to the recognition of happiness. Another one, Vatican saying 66. We show our feelings for friends not by wailing at their funerals, but by meditating on their lives. Another Vatican saying, let's see, LXXVIII. What is that? 50, 78. Vatican saying 78. The noble man is chiefly concerned with wisdom and friendship. Of these, the former is a mortal good, the latter an immortal one. So you can see from these fragments, for Epicurus, in order to live what he called the blessed life, we have to possess this immortal good, namely friendship. And he didn't advocate having a lot of friends. It's just the friends you do have, cultivate them and make sure it's genuine friendship. Oh, let me just share one more with you. This one actually became is quite moving. It's at the age of 71 in 270 BC. Epicurus died of kidney stones. The pains are said to be the most excruciating. On his last day, he wrote this to one of his friends. And so he's dying this painful death of kidney stones, and he writes this. On this blissful day, which is also the last day of my life, I write this to you. My continual suffering from stranguria, whatever that is, and dysentery are so great that nothing could augment them. But over against them all I set gladness of mind in remembrance of our past conversations. This is going to be an important element of Epicurus, the ability to create these experiences in one's life with others that are monumental, such that when you get old, you look back and you can recover those, and they become an element of pleasure. Over against all this pain, he writes, I set gladness of mind at remembrance of our past conversations. But I would have you, as becomes your lifelong attitude to me and to philosophy, watch over the children of Metrodorus. So that's just a little introduction to Epicurus's life. Let's look at the works of Epicurus. I told you he wrote over 400 papyrus scrolls. Not 400, 300. More than 300. I thought it was 347. And I told you that they've all been lost. Now here, this is important. The best, after we have these three letters, we have the Vatican sayings, and we have the principal doctrines. So that's all the original writings. Then we have this account of his thought by Diogenes Laertius. That helps a lot too. But the main source, there was a person, a great poet in Rome. His name was Lucretius, and he wrote a book called On the Nature of Things. And this was way after Epicurus had passed. And he wrote On the Nature of Things, which is a treatise on Epicurus. And he was in possession of all the writings of Epicurus. So people who are serious about Epicurus, they read Lucretius. Okay, so that's important. Lucretius. I'm not going to. It's just an important point about ancient Greek philosophy. So as I told you, what I want to emphasize here in these two lectures is Epicurus's ethical doctrine, because we have most of that. And we'll look at the atomic theory and his physics from his letter to Herodotus. And then the letter to Pythocles is his astronomy and meteorology. But those only insofar as they shine light on his ethical theory. Well, thanks to Diogenes Laertius, we have the titles of his books, but we don't have the books. But there are like 42 titles he names, but it's worth reading them or just listening to the titles of his books, because it gives an idea of what he was concerned about. So he wrote 37 books on nature. Okay. So he was a great student of nature, like the physicoi. And he was an atomist. So he believed that nature was made up of atoms and void. But unlike and this touches upon his physical theory. So he was an atomist, a materialist. And he believed this universe is made up of atoms and voids. You know, the word atom, tom means divisible. So a means un. So atom means undivisible. So there's these little atoms that we know of today. But then we divided them in modern times and we made nuclear power, right? So that's the atomic theory. Now, most of the physicists before Epicurus were strict determinists. But Epicurus realized that if everything is determined, then there's no ethics, because ethics has to do with choice. Without freedom of choice, then there's no right and wrong choice. Everything is determined. So he began to think about how can there be choice in this materialistic world. Well, he realized that the atoms have a swerve and they bounce off each other. And this creates chance. So he was a big exponent of there's certain things that can be determined, like the laws of physics, but there's other chance events. And so knowing about chance, then we need to learn how to respond to what's given by chance. We can't control it. That part is determined. There's another thing that's unfolding that we can't know of because of physics. So we need to learn how to respond to what's happening in the best way possible. And for that, we need practical wisdom. All the elements that Plato and Aristotle spoke of are there. The words are the same. Eudaimonia, practical wisdom, phronesis, all these words. But they're going to take on new meaning. And that reminds me, this is an important point too. All the key words in philosophy, and for any subject for that matter, but in philosophy in particular, the key words take on new meaning depending on who said it, who says it. So always take words, return the key words, not simple words like light or sugar. You know, these words mean about the same thing for everybody. But key words like justice or happiness or practical wisdom, these words take on meaning depending on who says it. Because philosophy is moving on that level where they're determining what are the meaning of these key words. So what happiness is for Aristotle is going to be different from what happiness is for Plato. Like for Plato, happiness is a harmony of the soul. For Aristotle, it's going to be an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. And for Epicurus, it will be something different. So the word is the same. Eudaimonia is the final purpose of human life for all three philosophers, but it's going to mean something different for all three also. So it's important to see what similarities. I mean, one could say, well, they all share the idea that eudaimonia is the final purpose of human life. But then what are the differences among these three? So you always want to return words, keywords, to who said it, and then not only who said it, but in the context in which they said it. So unless you do that, then everything gets muddled up and it's just chaos. So listen to the names of these books. 37 books on nature, a book on the atoms and the void, which is his definition of the world. He wrote a book on love, epitome of the works against the physicists. And we don't know what that is. These are just titles, right? But probably has to do with his critique of the determinism within physics. Against the Megarians, another one, problems, another one, the principal doctrines. What to choose and what to avoid, another book. Another one on the chief good, the summum bonum, the final purpose. On the basis of judgment, on the gods, on piety, on lives, on justice. He wrote a symposium, he wrote on sight, he wrote on the angle of the atoms, on contact, on destiny, on suffering, on prophecy, an exhortation, whatever that is, on idols, on music, on justice, and so many others, on kingship. He wrote a book on Anaximenes, and then all the letters, and only three extant letters. I told you, Menoasius, that's the one that's most telling in his ethical theory, and then to Pythocles and to Herodotus. So that gives a sense of what he was concerned with and how prolific he was. But let's move into his thought. So I like to divide his thought into two parts. So there's the negative part and then the positive part. The negative part has to do with eliminating, I'm talking about the ethical theory now. The negative side of the ethical theory has to do with eliminating all the obstacles to the good life, to living this life of well-being. So we have to eliminate whatever obstacles are in the way. That's the negative side. Then the positive side has to do with how to choose and what to choose. But before we go on, I should tell you this. I mean, you probably know this by now. Epicurus was a hedonist. It comes from the word hedone, Hedone. Hedone means pleasure in Greek. Now, when the Romans took hold of Epicurean philosophy, see, you know that after the fall of Alexander the Great, and then not long after that, Greece was conquered by the Romans. But the Greeks were so much more developed intellectually than Rome. The Romans were like the Borg. I like to think of them like the Borg. I don't know if you follow Star Trek, but the Borg, whenever they would conquer any other world, they would appropriate their culture. And this is what the Romans did, and that's why they became so great. Like when they conquered the Etruscans, they learned how to, the prowess in battle, for example, and strategy. And when they conquered the Greeks, they learned their intellectual life. Like all the doctors were Greek, teachers were Greek, because Greece had developed this culture so much higher than the Romans. But the Romans had this powerful military and they conquered the Greeks. So when Rome appropriated the philosophy of the Greeks, they didn't go back to the pre-Socratics. They didn't even go back to Plato and Aristotle so much. They went to later Greek philosophy. And the main proponents of late Greek philosophy, remember I told you there's the early, middle, and late period. The archaic period, that's the early period, the period of the pre-Socratics. Then the Hellenic, the classical period, that's the period of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then the later period is Hellenistic. That's the time of Alexander the Great and the late Greek philosophy. The main schools of thought were Epicureanism, and there wasn't just Epicurus, but he was the main hedonist. And then there's Stoicism too. And I'd like to take a look at the Stoics before we move on. And there were also the Cynics. You've heard the word cynicism. The Cynics had a very strong critique of civil society. And a lot of these words, they were a school of thought. They were the Cynics, and they had a whole body of developed philosophy, and they were called the Cynics. And they were called that because of their strong critique of the way people of civil society. And there were the Skeptics, who had a strong critique of the demonstration of knowledge, what we can know, and so on. So these are the four main schools of thought: the hedonism, Stoicism, cynicism, skepticism. But some people say every good Roman citizen was a Stoic, and Nietzsche said that every good Roman citizen was an Epicurean. So they were probably, who knows, unless you go back to that, there might be a way of finding out. But what is true about the whole thing is that the Romans appropriated late Greek philosophy. Now, the reason I'm talking about that is when they appropriated hedonism from Epicurus, they turned it into something that appealed to them more. So when Epicurus spoke of pleasure, the Romans turned it into physical pleasure, And that's the way pleasure is usually thought of. When Aristotle speaks of pleasure, and when Plato spoke of pleasure in the dialogue Philebus, which means lover of pleasure, Philebus, he's playing with that name, lover of pleasure, right? And there's a great dialogue by Plato called the Philebus. Somebody's name is Philebus, so he calls the dialogue that. It's all on pleasure. It's one of the late dialogues, and it's truly great and deep, great dialogue. But usually when someone speaks of pleasure, they speak of physical pleasure. And a physical pleasure is when a lack is fulfilled. Like if you're thirsty, then you drink, or you're hungry and you eat, and it brings pleasure. But when Epicurus spoke of pleasure, it's not only physical pleasure. Physical pleasure is a pleasure, but he spoke of spiritualized pleasures like friendship and like philosophizing. But there's one, the highest, and I want to sort of approach it more carefully, but I'll just tell you what it is now. It's called ataraxia, Ataraxia. Taraxia means agitations. You probably know that already, it means without. So without agitations. And what he means by that is tranquility, equanimity, like when we say peace of mind, a state of absolute peace, no agitations in your mind. I like to associate it with what the Hindus and Buddhists talk when they speak of nirvana, but there's no actual connection, physical connection between the Indian philosophy and Greece, but the ideas may be very close. Ataraxia for Epicurus is the highest pleasure, and I'd like to translate it perhaps. Like I said, what I've done in my career is I just leave these words in the original, like ataraxia, and just put it in the transliteration, Ataraxia. Just leave it like that, and then just talk about it. But if you do want to translate it into English, I think probably the best translation would be tranquility or equanimity. But again, it's probably best to leave these words untranslated. That way you can avoid all the connotations that cling to those words in English, and then you can get back to the original meaning. So we'll talk more about ataraxia, but there are two main elements to the negative side of his ethics. So as I told you, the main place to go for his ethical teaching is the letter to Menoasius. So I'm going to use that as the structure of my talk. But if you ever want to get deeper into Epicurus, there is Diogenes Laertius, and more importantly is Lucretius. And I wrote an essay on Nietzsche and Epicurus in 1998. It was published. I'll give you the bibliography later. I was going to read it to you, but it might not be appropriate for this class. But I'll give it to you at the end of my second lecture on Epicurus, and then you can check it out. It's published, if you're interested. It's published in Man and World, and it's on Epicurus and Nietzsche. So let's just focus for your reading, because you have that reading, the letter to Menoasius. So there's an introduction, and then there's certain parts of the letter. So we'll break it down into parts. So let's look at the introduction right now and look at the first part, which is eliminating the obstacles from the good life, from the blessed life. So what should we notice in the introduction of that letter? Well, the first thing to notice is the approach that ethics is based on finding out what is the final purpose of human life. So he's right in accordance with Aristotle here. How should one live in order to achieve eudaimonia? Because eudaimonia, or well-being, is the highest good, final aim of human life. So he accepts that from Aristotle. And Plato said the same thing, but now he's going to have a different idea about how to go about attaining that, and how to and what it is. Because eudaimonia is that for the sake of which we do everything. That's right out of Aristotle. Therefore, in order to live well and to realize our highest humanity, we have to meditate on the things that bring about well-being. Such meditation is the proper activity of the philosophy, of the philosopher. So at the beginning, there's an exhortation. Epicurus says that the young and the old should study philosophy. Philosophy is both for young people and old people. And that the purpose of philosophy is the attainment of eudaimonia. There are all kinds of questions in philosophy, but all those questions are questions that shed light, the answers of which shed light on this ultimate question: how should we live in order to achieve eudaimonia? So it's all about the well-being of the soul. And he says it's never too early or too late to attain eudaimonia. Therefore, it's never too early or too late to study philosophy, because philosophy is for that sole purpose, the well-being of the soul. And then he gives reasons why, which are interesting. He says the reason young people should study philosophy is that they'll achieve a eudaimonic life early in their life, so that their youth will not be wasted. There's a famous saying by Oscar Wilde that comes in modern times, as you know, Oscar Wilde, the great poet, that youth is wasted on the young. So he's saying if young people would study philosophy, then they would achieve wisdom early in life, and they would be able to achieve eudaimonia and not waste their youth. But nature will have it that youth is wasted on the young. So how to live when you're young and not have your youth be wasted? This is a deep insight, actually. So he's speaking to young people. If you know where you're going, you're going to get there first. So where are you going? Well, for Epicurus, where you're going is trying to live a good life and live a life of well-being. Well, what's going to help you is wisdom. But wisdom is wasted on the young. Youth is wasted on the young because the young don't have wisdom. So if you study philosophy young and take it seriously, then you can attain eudaimonia relatively young time in your life. And hence, as you grow old, you'll still retain the eudaimonia of your younger days. And that the old people should study philosophy too, because they will remain young. The old should study philosophy so that even as they grow old, they'll be young in virtue and be fearless of the future. This is going to be, being fearless is going to be an important ingredient for Epicurus. And he wants us to eliminate all fear from our lives. That's going to be the elimination part of it, the theory. So we have to study the means of securing well-being. And in other words, we have to study philosophy. Because when we have eudaimonia, we have everything. And when we lack it, we do everything to get it. In other words, when we have eudaimonia, we have everything. When we don't have it, even though we may be rich in every other way, we have nothing, he teaches. So in his introduction to this letter to Menuasius, it's an invitation to philosophy. For only by virtue of philosophy is it possible to attain eudaimonia, which is the highest good for humans. But we have to realize that for Epicurus, philosophy is not only a means by which one learns how to live well, it's not only a means for the attainment of eudaimonia. It's not just a means. For Epicurus, philosophy is an end unto itself. So it's one of those pleasures. The reason Epicurus is called a hedonist is because he puts pleasure at the center. But I already told you, unlike the Romans who turned it only into physical pleasure, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. That's what the Romans did to it. Not all the Romans, not Cicero, not Lucretius, not those Romans. They're different. I'm talking about the populace of Rome, the, the, the people who are not living philosophically. Those, not Lucretius, and not those people who followed Lucretius, or Diogenes Laertius, or took the time to actually read Epicurus. So there was this great misrepresentation of Epicurus during Roman times, and it lasted until modern times too. Like as soon as, and you mentioned Epicurus, even today, an Epicurean delight, you think of some sumptuous banquets and you think of special fine foods and drink. But Epicurus was teaching just the opposite. We'll get into that next time. He wants us to eliminate all unnatural, unnecessary desires and bring about this gratitude towards life itself without those kinds of sumptuous banquets. But philosophy is not just a means. It is a means for the attainment of wisdom. But it's not only that. The activity of philosophy is it's itself a pleasure for Epicurus. He says, pleasure keeps pace with growing knowledge. Pleasure does not follow learning, rather learning and pleasure advance side by side. That idea is a little bit in Aristotle. Remember I told you, eudaimonia is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. Well, there's a happiness that accompanies learning. Remember episteme and for Aristotle. But I would like you to begin to think about the similarities and differences between Aristotle and Epicurus. So as we're going to see as we move on, when we deal with that part of the letter to Menoetius that deals explicitly with the moral theory, the greatest good is eudaimonia, or pleasure. So a life in which one is able to maximize pleasure to the fullest and to minimize pain is a eudaimonic life. But that gets us into the positive theory. So let's wait on that. So there are two things that need to be eliminated. And rather than read my notes, I think I'm just going to speak impromptu now because it's getting tedious. I went through all of the fragments of Epicurus that support certain points, but I think it'd be better if I just spoke impromptu now. There are these two things that need to be eliminated. One is fear of death. He thinks all fears are rooted in the fear of death. So Epicurus thinks that all experience comes from sensation. Okay, everything comes through the senses. Whatever's inside of us has come through these five senses. But death is the cessation, the ending of all sensation. So if it's the ending of all sensation, then it's the end. He has this radical notion of finitude. That's a hard one to swallow for Christians, I know, and for later people that are influenced by Plato's philosophy, and even Aristotle. Aristotle thought the mind was immortal, but the highest part of our intellects is immortal. For Plato had all these theories, the immortality of the soul, and later philosophy, they're proving the immortality of the soul this way and that way. But for Epicurus, since he's a materialist, and there's only atom in the void, then death is nothing to us. So when death is here, you don't have to fear it because it's not here. When it's here, there's nothing to fear because you're not there to fear anything. So he says death is nothing to us. Okay. This idea, I mean, these kind of ideas take time, and I'm not asking you to accept this idea. If you want to believe in the immortality of the soul, that's fine, or reincarnation, or however. I never try to teach people how to believe or what to believe. But just give it try to understand what he's saying. It's a notion of radical finitude, just absolute nothingness after you die. And yet he's living this completely full life. So the two are not, he's not like living in this kind of nihilistic life, pessimistic life, where nothing matters. He's living this completely full life, but at the same time embracing this notion of radical finitude. So he thinks that the fear of death is the source of all of our fears. And once you become fearless of death, then you can get on the business of living a rich, full life. And there are fragments in the Vatican sayings and the principal doctrines that support that. So there's a lot more to that. I have all kinds of, the best way to understand that it would be to actually go to the text and think when he's talking about death and think about his attitude, his belief in death and how that's related to living a eudaimonic life. The other one, the other source of fear for Epicurus, he thinks, is an improper understanding of divinity. Now, it's interesting. I don't know. Sometimes Epicurus speaks of the gods in the plural, like the many gods of polytheism. And sometimes he'll speak of God in the singular. And it's hard for me to imagine that he would, use those two expressions interchangeably unless he entertains some notion of the unity of one divinity, especially if he was a student of pre-Socratic thought and Plato and Aristotle. All were monotheistic. They may have spoken of many gods, but if you study the metaphysics of Aristotle, the metaphysics of Plato, and most of the pre-Socratic, I don't know what percentage, but it's hard to find any polytheism among the pre-Socratic. Think of the aporon of Empedocles, for example. The one, right, that we emphasized. So, I mean, it's true to say that the Greeks were polytheistic people, but speaking of the many gods and speaking of the one, and Epicurus used those two terms interchangeably. Now, I find an interesting parallel in Epicurus's critique of popular religion with the notion of our attitude towards divinity that's prevalent in the Middle Ages and even in modern times. But it's not in the mystics. And so I gravitated toward the mystics. I would like to share with you, when we get into the second part of this course, some of the mystics like Meister Eckhart and Hildegard. We'll look at those too. But in popular religion, in the Middle Ages and popular religion today, there's this idea that we should, that we project human attributes to divinity. And so one of the things I find relevant in Epicurus's critique of popular religion, but it wouldn't reach deep into Christian mysticism. It only reaches certain theologians and into most people's belief, most people's attitudes towards the divine. But it doesn't reach into the mystics. It wouldn't reach St. Francis. It wouldn't reach Hildegard of Bingen. It wouldn't reach Meister Eckhart. Not the mystics. What is this? Attributing human attributes to the gods. Now, what is Epicurus's notion of the gods? Or of God? Let's use those two terms, because if you use them interchangeably, then it's easier to make his criticism of popular religion relevant to a more refined understanding of our relationship to God and our understanding of what God is. He considered the proper understanding of the gods or of God to be the first principle of the good life. Okay, there are The first principle is the proper understanding of divinity. The second is elimination of the fear of death. So he says God exists, or sometimes to say the gods exist. He uses those words interchangeably. And how do we know? Because mystics have perceptions of them. Remember, everything real for Epicurus has to be perceived. But perception is not just physical perception. When we see and hear things, it's connected with the mind, right? We don't just feel things. We feel a table, or we hear a sound, like outside somebody is cutting something. So I hear a chainsaw. I don't just hear vibrations, I hear a chainsaw because I have that concept in my mind, chainsaw. So the mind works together with perception. So the gods exist, he says. So he's not an atheist because they come to us in dreams, they come to us in perceptions. But popular religion errs in attributing to divinity the government of the world and the government of men, the control of the natural world, the feelings of, we project into divinity feelings of anger and love toward mankind. And he claims that all this is inconsistent with the blessedness of divinity. The same idea we'll find in Meister Eckhart. Like if I pray to God and I say, oh, please God, can you have mercy on someone, and this is a good person, why would you, can you help this person, please? And we're entering into a business transaction with God. We're trying to bend God's will. Or cast down my enemies and, be on the side of righteousness, God, please. Any kind of prayer to God that attributes to God. So we're trying to make God's will into my will. Instead of thy will be done, we're making my will be done. So we're attributing human characteristics to divinity. So Epicurus has this notion of maintaining the blessedness of divinity. Okay? If divinity is truly blessed, then it lives in absolute ataraxia, tranquility. And there's no disturbances in the soul of divinity. In other words, blessedness means, among other things, absence of agitations. Epicurus is going to focus on this throughout his ethical theory. Peace of mind, or tranquility, or equanimity. And the gods exist in complete ataraxia. But if the gods were concerned, or if God is concerned with the affairs of humans, they would have agitations in their soul. They'd be worried about us doing this and that. Therefore, since the gods are immortal and blessed in a state of pure ataraxia, then they're not concerned with the affairs of humans. So he has this notion that divinity exists, but it doesn't care about humans. Now that sounds blasphemous, I know, but he claims that to attribute any kind of agitations or any kind of bending of the will to the gods through human prayers is to denigrate the gods, is not consistent with the blessedness of divinity. It's making my will be done instead of thy will be done. That is to say, we must not attribute to the gods any care or anxiety such as would be implied in the government of the world, or any feelings of anger or favor towards men which would disturb or diminish their absolute tranquility. And this is exactly where popular religion makes its great mistake, he claims. The problem with popular religion is that it does not preserve the absolute blessedness and tranquility of the divinities, but goes on to attribute disturbing passions to them, which is alien to their nature. That is, it doesn't represent the gods consistently as they were originally perceived in their nature. It turns God into a concept of man. He writes, that which is blessed and immortal is not troubled itself, nor does it cause trouble to another. As a result, it is not affected by anger or favor, for these belong to weakness. It would attribute a weakness to God. But God is all powerful, we say almighty. If God is all knowing, all powerful, then what are we asking for? It's like a little child telling his father that he has to pay, the mortgage. And the father says, I know about the mortgage. Don't worry about it. Got you covered. It's that kind of idea. So Epicurus' popular religion is correct in the assertion of the existence of immortal divinities or of divinity, but it's impious and illegitimate to attach to the divinities the all too human tendency to punish, that's an important point, or to do harm to the wicked and to benefit the good. See, he wants us to do good because it's the right thing to do, not because we're getting rewarded or punished. He wants it to be pure. Religion is not a business transaction. And so his conception of the gods or divinity can be found in certain sayings in the principal doctrines and the Vatican sayings. Let me just read a few to you. That which is blessed and immortal is not, I read that one. It is folly for a man to pray to the gods for that which he has the power to attain himself. See, Epicurus, he gets this from Aristotle too, I think, but he tweaks it and makes it his own. He thinks it's in our power to live this rich, full life, a life of blessedness. So you don't need to pray to God for grace or anything, he's claiming. That you have it within your power to learn how to live, to develop this art of living. It's sort of like he helps those who help themselves kind of thing. I think you get the idea. Let me just read a few more to you just to make sure. He writes in the Principal Doctrine 12, it is not possible for one to rid oneself of his fears about the most important things if he does not understand the nature of the universe, but dreads some of the things he has learned in myths. Therefore, it is not possible to gain unmired happiness without natural science. So he thinks if you take a strict scientific view of the world, then death is nothing to us, and God is a divinity that exists in pure ataraxia. And we can share in that ataraxia, but we shouldn't try to bend the will of God to our own will. And we shouldn't try to project punishment and reward coming from God. It's no veil to prepare security against other men while things above us and beneath the earth in the whole infinite universe are still dreaded, he writes. So those two things, death is nothing to us and divinity exists, but not to project all too human qualities into divinity, to preserve its blessedness and don't act impiously. Those are the two obstacles to the good life for Epicurus. Dread of what comes after life and the belief in the immortality of the soul and false understanding of God and fear of death. What about fear of all kinds of other things like poverty or pain or all these other things? Well, he addresses those in the principal doctrines. With regard to pain, he thinks that if it's excruciating pain, it doesn't last long. If it's long-lasting pain, there's more pleasure within the pain. I remember when I was teaching this years ago, I had the oldest lady student, I think she was 86. She said, I disagree with Epicurus. I've been in excruciating pain, for a long time. But he claims there's nothing to fear in pain. If it's long lasting, there's more pleasure within that time period. And if it's short, if it's intense, it'll be short. About poverty, he said not to worry about that either. See, because as we get into the second part and that's the more substantial part, I'll make one more lecture on Epicurus, the second part of the ethical theory, the positive side. This is the negative side of the ethical theory. By negative, I mean eliminating fear of death, eliminating this idea of the immortality of the soul, reward and punishment, and a proper understanding of divinity, eliminating this all too human projection of human qualities into the divine in their perfect state. In other words, preserving the divinity of divinity. That's the negative side. The positive side is the ethical theory about choice. So elimination of the fear of death and a proper understanding of divinity. Those are the negative sides of it. Oh, about poverty, he addresses these other kind of minor fears. He thinks all fears are based on the fear of death, but there are other kinds of fears like poverty and so on. As we're going to see in part 2 of this address, that unlike the Roman interpretation, not Lucretius, but the typical popular view that Epicurus was teaching sumptuous pleasures. It's just the opposite. Epicurus has this whole thing of desire all worked out. And we'll get into that next time. But he wants us to eliminate all unnatural and unnecessary desires. He's got this whole thing worked out about desire we need to talk about next time. It's in the letter to Menoetius. But if you contemplate that and don't race through that and think about it, then if you eliminate all unnatural and unnecessary desires, and if the highest pleasure is nothing other than not having any pains in your body and agitations in your mind, then you don't need much to be happy. It's little that makes the best happiness. So he thinks that if, like right now, are you in pain right now? Excruciating pain? Probably not. I mean, some people are, but probably not. And if you could just get your mind to have no agitations, that'd be it. You would have the highest pleasure equal to that of Zeus, he says. So what I find appealing in Epicurus is this gratitude towards life, that there's this intrinsic pleasure to life itself, that you don't need much to be happy. If you eliminate all unnatural and unnecessary desires, then you're left with only natural, necessary desires. So you eat, you have somewhere to live, and you have some water, you have the basic things. And you have this wisdom, this tranquility in your mind. That's it. You don't have to. The other thing is, you don't have to scramble to get all these kinds of things. We think the more the better, the more I have, the better. And for Epicurus, it's just the opposite. And I remember there's a quote by Thoreau. He says, I consider myself wealthy by the number of things I can afford to let alone. So that goes in the opposite direction of modern society. However many things I don't need, that's how wealthy I am. See, it's just the opposite. Most people think that if I could only have this, then I could be happy. So that helps a lot in worrying about being poor, because all you need is some food and some shelter and the basic natural necessary desires. And friendship, that's free too. If you're a good person, a good friend, you could have it. So everything is at our disposal and it's easy to procure. But all these other things are really hard. So we'll be scrambling all our life to get, and besides, since our imagination is infinite and our desires are bottomless, you can always come up with things you need to be happy. So he wants to stop that. Send me some preserved cheese, he says, so that I may have a feast. You know, cheese, that's pretty easy to get. So it's just the opposite from this, the way people use the word Epicurus today, an Epicurean delight, like it's some sumptuous, fine foods and so on. What he wants is that if you eliminate the agitations of our mind and the pains from your body, then you've reached the highest level of pleasure. And then the pleasures that are accompanied, these spiritual pleasures, accompanying philosophizing, friendship, and living in this needless, in this unneedy way. So I find in Epicurus this sense of gratitude that's appealing to me, rather than feelings of resentment. All right, I'll spend one more time on Epicurus. We'll get into the positive side of the ethical theory in the letter to Menoesis.